Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar on understanding the food fraud puzzle hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS independent consultant Dr. Mehrdad Tashkrimi, SQFI Vice President of Technical Affairs Leanne Chuboff, and EAS Senior Director Alan Saylor. EAS independent consultant Mehrdad Tashkrimi is an expert in national and international food safety regulations, warehouse wholesale manufacturing, dairy, grain, poultry, and retail industries, HACCP, and food defense. He assists clients with organic requirements, FSMA, as well as foodborne pathogenic and spoilage microorganism characteristics and shelf life studies. Leanne Chuboff has over 30 years of food service experience, specializing in supply chain, food safety, and quality assurance. Currently, Leanne is the Vice President of Technical Affairs for the Safe Quality Food Institute and responsible for technical requirements of the SQF program, including the development, maintenance, and technical support of the SQF code and supporting materials. Alan Saylor is the Senior Director for Food Consulting Services at EAS. His expertise lies in the areas of food processing, particularly the area of dairy, infant formula, bakery products, food additives, and food packaging, as well as GFSI third-party certification programs. Alan has spent more than 30 years as a food processing and regulatory expert. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions of our panelists by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS and SQFI, and I'll turn the presentation first over to Alan Saylor.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. This is Alan Saylor, and my role today is just a very quick introduction into food fraud. I think that intuitively we understand what it is, but if we go to the next slide, we'll get a little bit of sense of how big it is. And frankly, as I was preparing, I was surprised myself at how huge and how much negative impact it has on not only the U.S. food manufacturing industry, but the global as well. There was a study done, and I'm sure since it was 2013, it has not gotten any better, of where seafood was labeled in a couple of different states, and they did an analysis to see if it was labeled properly. And the range of improperly labeled, and I'm using that term in a kind of kind, respectful way, is 18% all the way up to 56% of the seafood that was sold in a couple of states actually was mislabeled. Now, whether it was food fraud or not, I think we can assume that much of that was, but that's troubling when in some cases a consumer is getting a seafood product that is not what they think they're getting. Next slide, please. One of the more common things that we've known in the last 10 years, or everybody almost has heard about, is this melamine issue. Dairy products, infant formula. In fact, some babies apparently died in China because of it, and pet food. And pets, even in the US, were impacted by that. And this is probably the most egregious and a good example of what food fraud can really do. In one case, it's only economic, so it's only people's money. But in this particular case, babies died and pets died, and that is quite troubling. Next slide, please. Other more recent and probably almost as well-known incidents is the horse meat scandal incident in Europe, where horse meat was represented as beef, and as a result of that, there were now, was there illness? We don't know that there was, but it is clearly food fraud. Something less well-known is in China. 2017, there was a misrepresentation of a fairly popular hard liquor brand in China, and there were ingredients added that made people sick, severely so. And then finally, we know that it's serious enough that in the UK, the government is actually cracking down on fake food fraud issues. One thing more recent is the Dominican Republic. We heard that somebody else, an American tourist, died again in the last few days. Is that because of a food fraud issue in the minibar or not? We don't know. It's all speculation. But is that a possible recent incident? We don't know. Next slide. Articles also. Spice is particularly subject to food fraud because many of us kind of know what a spice is supposed to look like, but some spices are much more valuable and therefore easier or more subject to potential food fraud. This is economic in most cases. And how do you detect that? Well, Mirdad Karimi will be talking where detection can be determined and can be determined relatively in a short term. Next slide, please. Another piece of information that really gives us, I think this slide tells us the impact that food fraud has in the US and in the global food industry. There's a sense that manufacturers of food in the US lose between 2 and 15% of revenue because of food fraud that they were not aware of. And finally, there's an estimate by the Grocery Manufacturers Association, a trade association located in Washington, D.C., that the global industry actually loses $10 to $15 billion because of food fraud issues. Next slide, please. And so what are the types of food fraud? Well, there are many different types, and I think that Mirdad and Leanne will be talking about that, but it can range from just counterfeiting, substitution, dilution, where you're putting something cheaper in for something that costs more money, mislabeling, tampering. There's a lot of different categories of food fraud, or what constitutes food fraud. Next slide, please. Okay, and so what segments of the food industry are impacted? Well, as you look at this, there are a substantial range of different food sectors that are impacted by food fraud, and certainly these slides will be available at the end. We're not going to go into all the detail of every food sector, but you can see some are much more subjected to food fraud than others. Next slide. So where does food fraud occur? And this slide probably is best representing the fact that it occurs at every step. It can happen once the growers can sometimes add certain things that are less expensive, or a crop that looks like a more expensive crop. It can happen through the supply chain sector, all the way down in the nodes, all the way, I guess, up chain or down chain, depending on how you talk about it, all the way to the retailer. And the consumer obviously doesn't commit food fraud, at least there's no benefit for them, but there may be an economic incentive at every one of these areas. And please understand, the vast majority of the growers all the way through the supply nodes are not committing food fraud, but it only takes a few to really raise the concern of consumers and governments. Next slide, please. Finally, I just wanted to give a regulatory background to food fraud. In the Food Safety Modernization Act, there's a regulation on the preventive controls for human foods, and even before that, FDA had an economically motivated adulteration, which is, in US terms, food fraud. It's fraudulent, intentional substitution or addition of a substance in a product for the purpose of increasing the apparent value of the product, reducing the cost of its production. Next slide, please. And finally, if you really wanted to know the reference, all food manufacturers are required as part of their hazard analysis to indicate the idea of, or potential of, economically motivated adulteration as a hazard. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mirdad Karimi, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Depends on the area. My name is Mirdad. I'm glad to talk about ways of food fraud detection in this presentation. Next slide, please. So, just as a background, I'm working with the food authenticity program for determining non-targeted detection methods for dairy, olive oils, and honey. As Alan mentioned, they are actually one of those are the majority of food fraud issues at the moment. Next, please. So just for clarification, just put this slide to differentiate a little bit between food fraud and food defense, which are they are both fault, but they have different purposes, and it's for that just determine that. Next, please. So what is food fraud? It's actually, as you can see, it's intentional outlaw food compliance and misleading consumers. And as Alan mentioned, there are lots of issues with labeling, mislabeling, and they are having lots of concerns about how it can damage a consumer. The main concern is the safety and also losing money and financial loss for that. Next, please. So today, what we are going to discuss is how we can, what we can do for it, and there are certain sections that we can act in order to prevent in our facility. And the more important thing is the regulatory requirement after July 2019 for larger scale manufacturers to comply with the food fraud. And also the next year in 2020, that's going to be a smaller size or mid-sized plants to comply with food fraud. So let's see what we can do for it. Next, please. So there are two ways to find the best method to monitor. And after we implement the system, we need to make sure that we have a good monitoring system for detecting food fraud. And we can have other sources to find how we can deal with the food fraud when we have a food fraud implemented in our plant. Next, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, so right now the AOAC International is trying to determine the standard for food fraud prevention and detection, and the main framework is based on method availability and also method standardization for detecting food fraud. Next, please. So these are three main methods that has been used and is being used for detecting food fraud. Mass spectrometry is one of them, and polymerase chain reaction or DNA-based technology is another method, which we will discuss today a little bit more. That's most my background is mostly in this DNA-based technology section, and also liquid chromatography section that are used for detecting a variety of different food fraud in spice, extract, cereals, grains, milk, seafood, and oils. By the way, these methods can be used for detecting other food categories. These are just very basic separation and categorization for each of them. Next, please. So in here, I just put some slides about how we can use DNA-based method for detecting food fraud. So as you can see, we can use the food DNA-based technology. It's very successful, has been used for detecting food fraud in sausages and things like that. And it can go in a very high resolution detection. For example, to detect, differentiate between cows and sheep milk and feta cheese. It's not, it's still ongoing. There are some issues with detection of the feta cheese, but I think it's getting improved. And as you can see, we can also use it to detect different kind of meat using the DNA-based technology. Next, please. Yes, so this is also continuing, as Alan mentioned. So we can use DNA-based technology to detect any type of fraud in beef products. If this is an example that has been done by Ireland Food Safety Authority to detect donkey meat in beef product. And we can use DNA-based technology to detect originality of different meat product, as it can see in here. And also we can use it to detect spices, and also detect fish species, different fish species, and also, by the way, spices as well. Next, please. Yeah, these are also the final sections of the examples. We can use defective beans. We can detect corn and coffee husks and different type of different type of foods that has been examined and tested, and these are all DNA-based method, and we can use that as a good detection method. Next, please. So there are lots of advances on DNA-based technology, which the most important one is next-generation sequencing, which can be used for using to detect non-targeted approaches or non-targeted analysis. And as you can see, in non-targeted approach, we are trying to see what is in our sample without any background, and we can use non-targeted approach to detect that. And that's actually part of our task in AOAC, the working group that we are trying to develop standard for it. The current method is which we are uses PCR and qPCR are the targeted methods, which we have certain genetic markers that we are trying to follow up to detect certain food categories or food items in a matrix. Next, please. Yeah, so this is a little bit more description about targeted vs non-targeted. Well, each one can be used and each one could be effective for application, but we need to know why and how we are using any of them. There are pros and cons for each of these methods. And although the non-targeted approach is still ongoing and they're getting more advanced and advanced, it has its own pros and cons. But the general approach for both of these methods are that we need to know the reason and why we are running these type of monitoring plan, and also we need to have a good sampling plan and sampling approach for running these type of testing. Next, please. So this is just showing, for example, if we want to run next generation sequencing or for non-targeted approach or finding what is in our food. This is the procedure that is going to be happen for making a sample analyzed. Next, please. That's actually continuing what we have discussed. Why and how we use a good detection method is based on what we are planning to do and how we need to use these methods are all based on a good sampling plan and good analytical plan and good monitoring plan that needs to be in place for food fraud detection. Next, please. So as a conclusion, again, what we can discuss is there are lots of available tools and methods for food fraud detection, but we need to make sure that we have a proper monitoring system in place and a proper approach to use an affordable way of detecting food fraud in our facility. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon and evening or day, whatever, morning, wherever you are. My name is Leanne Chuba. I'm the Vice President of Technical Affairs at SQF, and I run the technical aspect of the SQF code, the audit, the code requirements, the certification bodies, auditors, auditor training, training centers, etc. So I run all that technical aspect at SQF, and so I am happy to talk to you today about food fraud and how food fraud is being interpreted by SQF and SQF sites. So I know we talked about definitions and terminology, but you know, as I was researching for this, it's easy to understand why food fraud is out there. You know, many create that economic fraud, but there is that distinct difference between food fraud and food defense, which one is intentional and one is unintentional to cause harm. So intentionally to cause harm is about food defense, but unintentional harm, but intentional substitution for economic gain is food fraud. So our presentation is specifically on food fraud, but I did intertwine some recent nonconformances about food defense in this as well. So I know Alan talked about these notable food fraud incidences previously. regarding the impact of food fraud and, the seafood that wasn't labeled to sell, seafood slide, that it wasn't labeled properly in previous incidences, melamine and horse meat, etc. But, this is what triggered food fraud to become so recognizable in SQF and the other GFSI standards. So horse meat really was the one that just kind of kicked it off and was the incident that really kind of broke the camel's back. And it was this incident that went to GFSI, and it formed a working group that stated we need protocol in place, we need requirements in place among all the GFSI certification program owners to address food fraud. And so there are so many incidences, and it wasn't just the melamine combined effort that, we don't know what we don't know. Next slide. And so what I did is I just did a recent search regarding the next, what was available, with incidences of reported food fraud. And in 2018, and these were just within 2 months, all these incidences of reported food fraud. And so, it was regarding, it includes wine, it includes virgin olive oil, and it, even in the United States, they were, accused of importing squid and selling it for octopus. So there is a lot of incidences within food fraud. And again, we don't know what we don't know. And so GFSI needed to put this in the requirements so that all of the audits that are conducted under a GFSI certification program like SQF include food fraud as well as food defense. Next slide. So this is just a list of, what is some of those, repeat victims like dairy and olive oil and seafood and honey and spices, and, just reading about food fraud and getting information on food fraud. Even 20% of Australian honey, there was an article just recently posted less than a year ago, but 20% of Australian honey isn't pure. And 1 in 5 of those boutique honeys is considered not pure honey. So there are still incidences that are happening, and what can our sites do about it? What can food sites, what can they do about it? Next slide. To kind of just give you an idea, and I know Alan did talk about rules are applied to food fraud as well as to food defense and intentional adulteration, and that final rule was posted, and compliance dates are determined based off the size of your business. But food fraud actually it's always been illegal to sell fraudulent food. So it's not like FSMA created a whole new category for fraudulent food. It's always been illegal to sell fraudulent food. And it's like Alan said, it's covered in the hazard analysis within FSMA and the preventive controls. Next slide. And so I wanted to share with you what the GFSI benchmarking requirements state. And the GFSI benchmarking requirements, and if you're not familiar with GFSI, GFSI states those requirements that every certification program owner or standard owner like SQF, BRC, IFS, what needs to be included in their standards. So oftentimes people ask me, why do you have, water quality, or why do you have air quality as part of, why do you have air quality as part of your requirements? And it's GFSI has that in there. So there's no negotiating whether you can have food fraud in there or not. GFSI states it in those requirements documents. It's something every certification program owner has to have. So building on these requirements within GFSI, they have what's called FSM, which is food safety management. And that means it's in the food safety management systems that these requirements have to be in there. And it applies to every industry scope. A little bit differently in some industry scopes, but for the most part, every industry scope has a requirement about food fraud. And it includes the requirements for conducting a vulnerability assessment. And it includes, And it includes that it's supported by the food safety management system, meaning that it's reviewed annually, it has management responsibilities tied to it. So there's internal audits that are conducted against it, so this is all captured within GFSI in the requirements document. It also further stated in the latest version of the requirements document that it has controls in there for the purchasing process to ensure that all of those outsourced materials and services that have an effect on food safety that are included in the food fraud mitigation plan. So with SQF, that's kind of how we looked at it. It's part of the food fraud mitigation plan as it relates to procurement of those sources. And brokers are just a little bit different simply because brokers have a different take on how they acquire food, but that they have to make sure that their suppliers have some type of food fraud plan in place as well. Next slide. So as it relates to the new version, so in 2020, next year, March of next year, or end of February, March of next year, GFSI will be publishing their new benchmarking requirements document version 8. So version 8 was out for public consultation about a month ago, and we're just reviewing those comments, those public comments now. And it pretty much remains the same as it relates to food fraud and food defense. There weren't many changes into it. The only thing that I saw differently is that purchasing was not specified. Doesn't mean it's not a part of the food fraud vulnerability assessment or mitigation plan, or any of the standard owners addressing that separately either. Next slide. So within SQF, how do we handle food fraud within SQF? Within SQF, we look at food fraud in two different sections, kind of following exactly how GFSI laid it out. So under 2.7 is our food fraud and food defense section. 2.7.1 is about food defense, and it outlines what the site needs to have in place. It includes that they need to have a food defense plan in place, to have do a threat assessment and include control procedures, etc. It also includes a requirement to challenge the system each year, and I'll go into that in just a little bit. And under food fraud, we look at it in two sections. We did break it up following GFSI. So food fraud does have to have that vulnerability assessment, include a mitigation plan, and make sure that it's verified at least annually as part of that management review, and then also that the records are available. And then we also took that part about purchasing and put it as part of the approved supplier program, so that the vulnerability assessment is included as part of the approved supplier program, and that the mitigation procedures or mitigation plan is in place so that it evaluates the identified food safety vulnerability from those incoming ingredients and materials, and that they are controlled to ensure that they're not going to be fraudulent. Next slide. And so I wanted to share with you what some of our top minor and major nonconformities are as it relates to food defense and food fraud. So one thing that's not highlighted on this, and I apologize, but under the minor category, 2.7.1.3 is the food defense plan, and that is our top minor nonconformance. And if you look at 2713, if you use SQF, but one of that is how the food defense plan is challenged. And that seems to be a question mark for auditors as well as suppliers, understanding how do you challenge something that you really don't want, it's your food defense plan, you're not going to share it with anybody or have, test it out or anything like that, because you don't want to just put your facility or your site, make it susceptible. So we do ask that it's almost like a mock challenge. What would you do if the cameras weren't working, or if the doors were open, or if somebody was wandering in your facility, kind of create that mock scenario. Or you could actually challenge and hire somebody to challenge the facility, knowing that there isn't going to be any threat to your facility. So kind of wanted to mention that in food defense, because it is one of our top minor nonconformances. But as you can see, our top one of our top minor nonconformances is in food fraud, 2.7.2.1. And if you remember from the previous slide, it is in regards of conducting that vulnerability assessment. Next slide. So as it relates to nonconformances, we also looked at it based off of the food sector categories. And you can look at the gold bars and those food sector categories, those top food sector categories for food fraud and food defense, who receive these is bakery, produce processing, dairy, and food ingredient manufacturers. And it, you know, I don't think there's anything special about these particular processes. I believe that it kind of follows where our top food sector categories are in certificates. So there isn't really anything except for the fact that we have a lot of certificates in bakery, produce processing, dairy, and food ingredients that would maybe prompt why these are so high. And it's probably too that many of these are susceptible to some of those top frequent items that are considered fraudulent, like spices or olive oil or dairy in general, or any of those other food ingredients, starter cultures, etc. So it might be that these areas are more susceptible as well. However, you know, I think it really does kind of follow the fact that we do have a lot of certificates in these food sector categories. Next slide. So when you look at the breakdown of the nonconformance, I wanted to break it down as it relates to the particular incident and, you know, where it was. And so you're breaking down many of these food sector categories, but really 10% of all of our nonconformances that we've issued, whether minor, major, there was no criticals to food fraud or food defense, but minor or major, 10% were linked to food fraud or food defense. So we're having a lot of issues with sites that are having challenges in implementing the food fraud program. And when it comes down to it, it really is looking at the vulnerability assessment when it comes to food fraud. So conducting that vulnerability assessment, and many sites just aren't doing the vulnerability assessment. It's not that they are doing it wrong, but many times they're just not doing it, or a lot of times they're not including all of their ingredients and just a sampling of their ingredients, and it's not a full assessment of the site or their incoming ingredients. And so a lot of times the site just isn't conducting the vulnerability. You can see by far of the number of nonconformances that is really challenge that we're having with sites is actually putting in the mitigation plan and what to do once they've identified a particular vulnerability in food fraud. And so how do I make sure that, you know, my spices aren't going to come in, you know, fraudulent or combined with another ingredient? You know, do I always have to receive, you know, the full spice and grind them myself? Is that going to address the threat? Do I have to do the DNA testing to ensure my meat is the meat that I'm receiving? You know, what are some of those mitigation strategies that I need to put into place in order to address the vulnerabilities that I identified? And so really it's the unknown that, you know, that we don't know. Of those vulnerabilities, less than 1% were to the supplier approval program. So, you know, I'm not sure if it's, you know, like the auditors are probably auditing to say that you haven't done the vulnerability assessment. I'm not going to keep going back and, you know, where those challenges are. And so basically it's to those two things that the site is having challenges in understanding how to conduct that vulnerability assessment, where do I go, how do I do it, and then once identified any potential threat is really figuring out what the mitigation strategies should be. And you know, I think we heard a lot of great examples of what we could do to protect the supply coming in as it relates to any identified vulnerabilities. So there's a really good information, especially for some of the sites that are out there. Next slide. So as it relates to those, incidences and what specifically are those areas of nonconformance. First up, in food defense, it's really the site's challenging of the food defense program is the inconsistent application of the site's food defense program. It's really, they're literally not following what their food defense program should be. If their doors should be locked, they're unlocked. If visitors should be identified, they're not identified. And anybody responsible, people responsible for that food defense program, they're not identified in there. And a lot of things too is the auditor calibration is kind of understanding what do we mean by challenging the food defense program. So there might be some miscommunication there. As it relates to food fraud, as I stated, they're really what it comes down to it in all of those instances is that there isn't any plan in place. The vulnerability assessment just isn't being conducted. So I don't know if sites don't know what to do, if they're not aware that food fraud has been added, because this was a recent addition into our S2F code in edition 8. So I'm not quite sure if the sites just aren't aware that food fraud was added and they just don't know about it, or if they don't know what they don't know. If they don't know that the food fraud plan, what they need to do for a vulnerability assessment, and also that they're not evaluating all their ingredients. They're not looking at everything that is coming into the site, or mainly even the susceptible ones, those repeat performers. Many of them aren't looking at what some of those, all of those ingredients in their site. And they also they don't have any mitigation plans in place. So their mitigation strategies are, maybe they've identified a few vulnerabilities, but they don't even know what to do in order to address some of the vulnerabilities that they've identified. So for S2F, this is new for our site. It was just released in edition 8, which was a couple of years ago. But between auditor calibration and site calibration, it's truly figuring out the unknown. And I will admit, I didn't know if food fraud belonged in the S2F code for a couple of reasons. I believe that we needed to address food fraud. We needed to address it because, again, it's the unknown. We don't know what we don't know, and fraud is occurring. I mean, we looked at the data and the statistics that, Alan presented in some of the articles that I looked up. But, we need to make sure that our auditors are calibrated, that we understand what exactly that we're looking for. So there's this kind of collaborative effort. Next slide. So, kind of breaking it down, it's kind of looking at intentional versus unintentional contamination, right? And so we want to take a look at what that middle is, because there is a lot of crossover as it relates to food defense and food fraud, economically driven versus unintentional adulteration. And I think that's also the challenge that we have, is that we're only looking at food fraud from a food safety aspect. And so we're assuming that a particular incident, and Alan talked about the horse gate scandal and whether it was food safety or not food safety, I think we're not clear whether that was or not. I mean, there's a lot of potential for it to be a food safety issue if, if horses, for example, were domestic horses and treated their feed or their antibiotic usage or vitamins or whatever aren't approved for human consumption, but, we don't know. And so there's always that middle ground. And I think if we're only focusing on if it's a potential food safety threat, we might lose out on the true meaning of it wasn't intended to be a food safety threat. It's an economic motivation with the unintentional food safety aspect to it. So we need to kind of open our eyes as we're doing these vulnerabilities to truly look at food fraud, whether it's food safety or not food safety, because the intent isn't to cause harm. The intent is to make money, and we need to understand those differences. Next slide. So this slide I borrowed, borrowed from John Spink at Michigan State, and I just kind of like this slide because I think to prevent by understanding the motivation. And so I like to figure out what that motivation is. And here you kind of look at the cross sections where the motivation for food quality and food fraud for not doing it properly is economic gain. I mean, I'm going to cheat on my ingredients, or I'm going to try and, dilute the juice a little bit more so it's not 100, 10% fruit juice, but maybe 7% fruit juice. Who's going to know? So understanding that motivation. And then for food safety and food defense, I mean, it could be, it's unintentional, but the end is that it's going to cause harm, right? So intentional versus unintentional, the motivation where it's going to be economic gain versus, a public health hazard or something like that. In understanding that motivation as to what you would do in order to put in the right control measures. So for food defense, what are you doing to control, to prevent intentional contamination? And same thing with food fraud is what are you doing to prevent that unintentional contamination when the intent is there. So I know it gets confusing and sometimes we mix the terms together, but really see food fraud versus food defense and the motivation and the action, I think can really kind of help clarify where you need to start and what you need to identify. Next slide, please. So within food fraud, what do you need to do, what do you need to do in order to what's required? So with food fraud, what's required is that with food fraud, you have to conduct that vulnerability assessment, understand the impact and the overall risk assessment, implement those mitigation strategies. You have to always review and verify, and then make sure you keep your records. So it's kind of understanding, what you need to do, where those threats are, or those vulnerabilities, as we say, and then identifying that and implementing your mitigation procedures. Next slide. And so the biggest question that I get is, where are sources of information? So do you have a mock vulnerability assessment that I can use? Is there something that I can reference? And so we get a lot of questions regarding that. And so there is a lot of information out there. Between SSAFE has some really great free tools that are available. So you can just go to SSAFE and identify, they have vulnerability assessments, and I mean, it's a great resource itself. Michigan State, another good resource. Dr. Spink has been very helpful for us and our stakeholders, and so they're a really good resource itself. And there's some, FSMA has some stuff on food defense, and USP still has some stuff that's the tools such as Horizon Scan is out there, Foodikai is out there, Discernus is out there, and those are all paid for tools, resources, and so you could, you can pay, it's a subscription-based fee for some of these folks. And then, of course, your host of this webinar, EAS, is just has all the resources that are available that can help you on addressing many of the challenges that our sites have, is even conducting a vulnerability assessment or figuring out what your mitigation strategy should be. So there's tons of information out there. Again, I think that the biggest obstacle is trying to implement this program and tapping into the resources that are available. So my recommendation would be to just reach out and get some, assistance as to where to start and what you need to look for. And I think there's a lot of great resources that are available just at your fingertips. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my slide or my presentation. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. And we have a number of questions that have been sent in. Is there any food fraud tool for factories to use?
Well, so It depends on what type of food fraud monitoring plan is in place. So if it goes for more detail and advanced tools, I would recommend to use certified laboratories for analysis of samples. For a plant, generally, because they are limited availabilities of tools and materials, especially to detect, I would say the general plans for food fraud would be an option. Otherwise, for running a sample, definitely needs to run through a laboratory, and that's why we explain that there is a need for talking and consulting with experts about doing that. Thank you.
Alan, I'll direct the next one to you. It is food fraud prevention. Sounds like developing a HACCP for food production. How and why is milk a susceptible food for fraud?
Excellent question. And the value of milk versus things that you can make look like milk is substantially different. Without giving people too many ideas, I could take certain white colored powders, add water to it, and give it a texture and use less milk or less dairy ingredients, and potentially have a product that might look like and maybe slightly taste like the finished dairy product, whether it be milk or yogurt or ice cream. And so therefore these products the ingredients are expensive. Milk is an expensive ingredient, and any food where the ingredients are expensive is highly susceptible to fraud, and people are very creative about finding substitutes. The melamine, for instance, probably would have never been detected for a long period of time, except it started causing the death of infants and pets. Because people that knew chemistry very well knew how to make the tests read something that really wasn't true because they knew the shortcomings of the test. So getting back to Mirdad and his points, there is substantial work being done in the research arena and at laboratories and at FDA and USDA to, with reasonably time turnarounds and reasonable prices. If you suspect food fraud, there are laboratories out there that probably have the ability to determine whether that's occurring or not from your suppliers. Thank you.
Thank you. Leanne, our next question is, why is food fraud at the farm level?
Yes, I get that question a lot. And I hate to say because GFSI said so, but really it's in GFSI. But I think Alan had a great slide earlier on in his presentation that kind of identified potential threats at each of those levels. So there is a vulnerability assessment that needs to be conducted, and it does break out what those requirements are. But I get that question a lot, and according to GFSI, there is a potential threat there. And again, Alan had a great slide that talked about using plant alternatives. I believe, Alan, that's what you were talking about, is this kind of replacing different types of plants and calling it something else, maybe something cheaper, but it could still be potentially a, cause harm. So it was identified systems that, address any of it. Even in storage and distribution, it's food fraud is applicable. So all those industry scopes require a food fraud vulnerability assessment at a minimum.
Thank you. And Mirdad, I'll direct the next one to you. It is regarding Kobe beef and its mislabeling. And the person is asking if you have any suggestions for catching this. Before Mirdad mentions it, I'll just also mention that he is publishing an article. It'll be out on August 12th on food fraud detection, and that will be published in Meeting Place magazine. And Mirdad, so if you'll answer any thoughts on suggestions for catching fraud in Kobe beef.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very good question. So there are certain ways that we can use DNA-based technology to detect food fraud. So just in this very simplified way of explanation, so we can find certain genetic markers for each individual food item, for example, horse meat or cow meat or any type of other foods, and those sections of genetic information can be replicated and can be detected by PCR-based technology and DNA-based technology. I hope it's explained in a very simplified manner. So we just do what would happen is just get a few grams of sample, generally less than 100 grams, and then just extract DNA from it and run the analysis and find what is the content. There are two ways. One is non-targeted, one is targeted. The meat, can you detect that? So that's going to be next generation sequencing, or they're targeted based, which we know that this is horse or we know that this is cow. Please verify that, yes or no. So that's going to be a targeted approach. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more, and we've got a number of people who've asked about tools and just recommendations for how to conduct a vulnerability study or assessment. And I'll let each of you respond, whatever your thoughts are.
Leanne, you might be best to go first.
So just what kind of tools are out there to conduct your vulnerability assessments? Is that the question? I kind of want to just make sure.
Yes, exactly. How do I conduct a vulnerability study? Yeah. One version, another asked about tools that are available.
So, you know, there are a number of resources, even with, you know, vulnerability assessments, like sample vulnerability assessments. I know SSAFE has a great tool that's out there that you can use, and using, you know, my recommendation, because that is one of the biggest nonconformances that we have, is to use a consultant or use a resource that you trust. I mean, again, I know EIS is sponsoring this website, but they obviously have a lot of information as it relates to food defense or food fraud and food defense, but food fraud and conducting those vulnerability assessments. So my recommendation is, I mean, you really want to, this isn't just a requirement to meet the code, and I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but this isn't just a requirement to meet the code, but it's a requirement to protect the public health. So you want to do it the right way. So I would invest the resources and the time to, you know, build a relationship and get some trust and really seek out the right help that you need in order to conduct it properly.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We do have a couple additional questions, but we've run out of time. Mindy, specifically your question regarding seafood, we have an article on the EAS website under the section EAS in the news, and I will forward you a link to that, and I believe that will answer your question. I'd also like to invite everyone to join us on July 9th. We have our next webinar, which is on pest control and food plants. And thank you everyone for joining us. You'll be receiving a survey after the webinar. If you'd be kind enough to fill that out and just give us your thoughts, we appreciate it. And thanks again, and thanks to Mehrdad and Leanne and Alan for presenting today. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.